series, and I must say we've enjoyed every single moment of it. The people have spoken with such passion and such intellectual interest and purpose. I've really been very inspired. I want to briefly just give you just a bit of housekeeping. If you've enjoyed this course, you might enjoy other courses that are organized by the Abraham Institute. And we have registration forms here, so just fill them out and leave them here, and we'll be happy to contact you. As an example of our programming, future programming, from mid-October we're going to have a 4-week course called Screening the Stranger in Multicultural Australia. And the course will unravel the difficulties and complexities of those representations over time in the following ways. Them and Us, early cinematic representations of non-white Australians, the threat and spectacle, issues of gender, TV, the stranger in our own homes, and reversing the camera lens. And the presenter will be Geraldine Bluestein, Adjunct Associate Professor at the Hawke Research Institute, University of South Australia. So this is just an example of the kinds of programming that we continue to have. And having done my little advertisement, I'm now going to introduce Philip Wilson, the Archbishop of the Catholic Diocese, and he will introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really honoured to be asked today to introduce our speaker. It's a really important topic for us to consider. And in welcoming the very Reverend Frank Nelson, the Dean of the Cathedral, I'd also like to just mention Professor Driver, who was supposed to give this presentation tonight and has been quite ill. So we take this opportunity to wish her all the best and hope that she'll soon be really well again. Look, when we look at these issues about the different places in the world that have been torn apart with one conflict or another, it's possible to do a study of those and consider the realities of them at a distance. People can become quite expert by looking at documents, by going over history, by talking to many people who maybe were involved. But a really worthwhile way of being able to speak about these matters is to listen to somebody who actually was involved and there. A person who had real live contact with the people who are actually part of the experience of apartheid in South Africa. And I think that's the wonderful perspective with which Frank can guide us today. So I warmly welcome you and thank you for your willingness to be with us and to provide this opportunity to our Abraham Institute to present a really good presentation about South Africa. So thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everybody. This time yesterday, I had assumed that I would be in the cathedral tonight at a service at 6 o'clock. Lynn came and spoke to me and said, the scheduled speaker is not able to do it. Would I be prepared to step in? And sucker that I am, I said, okay, I'm going to go. So where does one start? I think, first of all, I want to say that I cannot speak about the Truth and Reconciliation process that happened in the 1990s and early 2000s. It's not part of my story. I wasn't in South Africa at the time, so which I think was the advertised topic. So if you feel you want to walk out, do feel free to go. I thought that my approach would be to tell you some stories around, weave my story around people that I've known and met and had association with. And I should also say that I'm most used to public speaking with a pulpit in front of me and people who don't answer back. Having said that, I am actually very happy to be interrupted, and if there's something that you'd like to just tease out a bit more, don't wait till the end, just interrupt, because sometimes that actually brings out things that are of interest. Obviously, if somebody starts hogging it too much, we'll just move on in the nicest possible way. So, first of all, I was born in 1955. If you know anything of South African history, perhaps Alan Paton, author of Cry the Beloved Country, will come to mind. I think he wrote that in 1947-48, just about the time of the general election which brought the Nationalist Party into power after the war. Took General Jan Smuts, who was became a great world leader, instrumental in setting up the League of Nations, which grew into the United Nations, but of course neglected his own home constituency and ended up being booted out. In the 50s, the 4 pillars of apartheid began to bite. I'm not sure I can remember them all, but one of them was the Immorality Act, who you could marry or not marry, against black, white, could not marry white, and so on. Everybody was classified according to race. The Bantu Education Act, which had far-reaching implications on education, particularly education of black people, and through the mission schools. And 2 churches made opposite decisions. The Anglican Church, which I'm an Anglican priest, the Anglican Church at the time said, we will close our institutions rather than teach according to the Bantu education restrictions. The Roman Catholic Church said, it's better to have some education than nothing, and kept them open. And I think there's a bit of research and history to be written about as to the right or wrongs of that. But nonetheless, a lot of the mission colleges and schools that people like Nelson Mandela, Robert Mugabe went to, these wonderful institutions that provided education for black African people, many of them were closed in the 1950s and early 60s. And the other pillar of apartheid, of course, was the Group Areas Act, which said where people could or could not live. And I had rather hoped that a friend Sybil might have been able to be here, because her story weaves in and out of Cape Town and the clearing of District 6, which was a wonderfully vibrant, lively area, which in the 1960s was declared to be white. And most of the people lived there were of mixed race, and they were shunted out into what's now known as the Cape Flats and new townships like Munnenberg and others. But my story really is about people, and I thought I'd use people to help tell something of my story. No particular order. I just sat down at lunchtime today and jotted down names. So the first one on my list is a guy called Gert. Very Dutch Afrikaans name. I met him in my first parish in a small country town area, probably 30 people. A church on a Sunday morning was considered a large number, and I was intrigued that this man would come to the English church. And he told me his story one day that during the Second World War, South Africa went in to fight, as did Australia, with the UK. But it was very divisive among the white community, and a very, very narrow vote that saw South African troops fighting alongside the Allies. And a lot of Afrikaans-speaking people, people of Dutch, or Boers, I don't know what the terminology you're familiar with here, depends where you come from, did volunteer. And South African troops were all volunteers, and they wore a little orange patch on the shoulder tab which said, I'm a volunteer. When he went to his own church, the Dutch Reformed Church, he was kicked out, he was expelled. And he told me that in about 1939 or 40, he had no church to go to and found his way into the Anglican Church, this English church, which when I was active in, and I'm really mostly in the 1970s and 80s was my ministry there, was known as Tutu's Kerk, Desmond Tutu's church, in most derogatory way of reference to it. So there he is. And now what that reminds me is that a lot of my story as a white South African is actually tied up with the conflict between the two white races, those of English origin and those of Dutch and Huguenot, French Huguenot origin. The Dutch arrived in South Africa 1652 to establish a farm, to grow fresh vegetables, to stop scurvy on the long voyage around Africa to the east. And within 20 years, the renegades, I guess, had broken free from this tightly controlled Dutch
Across
area.
the almond tree fence.
Yes, the fence. And they discovered the wonderful rich land, not dissimilar to some of Australia's history. In then, of course, the Napoleonic Wars came along much later, and by default, South Africa became British twice. First just for a few years, and then a bit later, about I think it was 1814, became a British colony. And in 1820, the first major group of British English settlers was sent out to South Africa. And my ancestor, Thomas Nelson, was on one of the ships. And so I grew up with this story of heroism and reading some of the diaries, fascinating diaries. These were townspeople mostly, who were given 90 acres, sounded huge amount, whole new life to begin. One of the pieces I remember reading in a diary, he wrote home, said, I just can't understand. I dug a good 3-foot deep trench, planted the carrots in the bottom of it, filled it up with good topsoil, and they haven't grown. Total ignorance about any farming. You could run maybe 2 sheep on 90 acres. It's South Australia, and that part of South Africa is not dissimilar. Ozzie Swart. Ozzie, a great friend of mine from my theological college days. His origins are Bushman, which is, if you've seen the film The Gods Must Be Crazy, remember the guy who picks up the Coke bottle and all those click, click, clicks in his language. So in his ancestry is Bushman, Dutch, and Scottish. His home language is English, and I have one vivid memory of him preaching in English in a Xhosa-speaking congregation. They all assumed he was Xhosa, which he's not at all, being interpreted by Tim, who's a white person whose Xhosa was far more fluent than most of the local people. So that's one of these sort of little anomalies there. He's now Bishop of Kimberley and Kuruma. Kimberley is the great diamond place in the 1860s, enormous hole where the diamond miners dug down. Next door to us at one stage in Johannesburg were the Smiths. In fact, I never got to know their name, so I'm just using that name. They were English immigrants who'd come out in the sort of mid-1970s. This is late to 1990 or so. And they had never had it so good. They came from working class background in the UK, arrived in South Africa because they had a white skin. They were immediately in this sort of upper class area. And many of the white English immigrants supported very strongly, I suspect, the National Party because it was advantageous to them. I should just go back to one of my earliest memories. I was, as I said, a white South African growing up in apartheid. I never knew, in the 36 years that I lived in South Africa, I only knew one government. It doesn't ever change. Interestingly, even though it was only among the white voters, 4 million out of 30 million people, the Nationalist Party never got more than 50% of the vote because of the loaded country votes. So your 2,000 voters in a rural seat would get one MP versus, say, 10,000 in an urban seat. But my first real recollection, realizing that there are differences between white and black, I probably was 5 or 6 years old, certainly young enough to have to hold my father's hand when we crossed the road. We were going to the shops. And when we got down to this road, there had been an accident and a man had been knocked down by a car, pedestrian. And I remember, sort of have a vague memory of blood being around. Of course, lots of people around, and an ambulance arrived, and I was very excited, it was flashing lights and all the rest, and it stopped, and 2 men in white coats got out. They looked at the person lying on the ground, and then they got back into the ambulance and they drove off, leaving him on the ground. And I said to my Dad, "What's going on?" And he said, "Oh, it's a white ambulance and he's a black man." So that's, I don't know, leave it with you. I think of Peggy and Philip Twyla, both principals of schools. Peggy, I don't know where she's gone on to, what she's gone on to do, but one of those sort of leaders, people who naturally attract others, and a great leader. Philip, however, although he's principal of a school, was still struggling to get his matric when we knew him. And he would come to my wife, who's an English teacher, for lessons on Shakespeare. He couldn't get Shakespeare into his head. And he would bring his tape recorder and sit there, and she would speak and talk about Julius Caesar and Macbeth and all this. And then every now and again he'd switch the tape off, because he'd say, this is treason. What you're talking about, I can't, if I'm found with this stuff, this conversation.
Why was that?
Because it's criticising the government.
Oh. Wow.
Well, there's a lot of, I guess, good question.
Yeah.
Why was it? That was the fear that people lived under.
Wow.
So you weren't, free thinking was not encouraged, I have to say. Not at all. When I was ordained in 1978, so I'm talking my professional life was for the next 12, 13 years. And as a white person, I was not allowed into black areas. So South Africa was divided, segregated. This Group Areas Act said where white people could live, where black people could live, and where the so-called coloured people could live. Now, to be classified coloured meant that somewhere along the line there was mixed race. And there were wonderful tests to make sure were you coloured or not. One of them was known as the pencil test. So you would go along to the official, and he'd take a pencil and he'd stick it in your hair. If it fell out, it meant you were white because you had straight hair. But if you had this sort of curly African hair, then clearly you, and even though you might be white-skinned, you were classified as coloured. Another friend of mine, Garth, who's interesting, also now a bishop, showed me his ID booklet once, on one occasion, and his parents were classified, one was Cape Malay, the other was something else, and they couldn't decide where he should be. His classification was simply other coloured. And of course, depending on your classification, it showed where you lived, what sort of school you went to. So white schools were, say, given the equivalent of maybe $8 per student. Coloured schools, $3. Black schools, $1. That sort of ratio of money spent on education. Yes.
How were you
another classification altogether. So Natal, when I was there were 4 provinces in South Africa: Cape Province, Natal, Orange Free State, and the Transvaal. Natal was a large Indian population who were brought out to work on sugar cane plantations, and they were Indian. They were classified as Asian. Interestingly, the Japanese in the 70s anyway, because they were good trading partners and bought a lot of the iron ore, were classified as honorary white. So they could go to restaurants, theatres, hotels and so on, but the Indians couldn't, nor could the coloured people, nor could the black people, of course. Henry Naidu, as the name goes, you will recognise an Indian. He was a fellow student of mine at Theological College. The Orange Free State banned Indians from staying overnight. I think they could actually stay for 72 hours, but it was generally understood that you could not spend a night there. And he and I and others were going on a student project into Lesotho, which is a small mountainous country completely surrounded by South Africa. Most of the people, the men anyway, worked on the gold mines as migrant workers. But